In Denver International Airport, a disabled veteran was about to face his worst nightmare at a TSA checkpoint. What started as routine security screening took a shocking turn when he encountered a power-hungry supervisor who saw his sacrifice as a threat. Gavin "Tank" Walton wasn't your typical passenger. For 6 years, he had rebuilt his life after losing his leg in Afghanistan, known for helping fellow veterans navigate civilian challenges. When TSA demanded he remove his prosthetic publicly, triggering a PTSD episode, he activated an emergency alert that would change everything. What began as a father's wedding trip became a viral symbol of veteran mistreatment, and 18 minutes later, a Black Hawk helicopter landed outside. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm's harsh beeping at 0530 hours pulled Gavin Walton from restless sleep, though he'd been awake for the past 20 minutes, staring at the ceiling and listening to his heart pound against his ribs. The familiar weight of anxiety pressed down on his chest, not the sharp panic of his worst days, but the steady, grinding pressure that came with breaking routine. Emma's wedding, tomorrow. He sat up slowly, methodically swinging his right leg over the edge of the bed while keeping his left stump carefully positioned. The morning ritual never changed. Deep breath, assessment. Pain level today was a manageable 4 out of 10. The phantom sensations in his missing limb more like distant whispers than screaming voices. "Okay, Tank," he murmured to himself, using the old call sign that had stuck long after Afghanistan. "Let's get moving." The prosthetic sat in its usual spot beside the nightstand. The titanium and carbon fiber limb that had become both his salvation and his daily reminder. 6 years since the fitting, and he still approached it with the same careful respect he'd once shown his rifle. Both were tools that could save or betray you, depending on how well you maintained them. The sock liner came first, rolled up his residual limb with practiced precision. Then the prosthetic, aligned just so, the seal creating that familiar vacuum sensation. Weight test, balance check. A few tentative steps across the bedroom floor, his gait settling into the rhythm that had taken months to master. In the bathroom mirror, he saw a 42-year-old man who looked older than his years, gray threading through brown hair that he kept military short out of habit, lines around hazel eyes that had seen too much. The scar on his left temple from the same IED blast that took his leg was barely visible now, but he knew every millimeter of its path. Coffee brewed while he went through his morning stretches, working the muscles that had to compensate for what was missing. The VA Medical Center had taught him the routine, but it was Emma who'd made him promise to keep doing it. "Dad, you're not just surviving anymore," she'd said during one of his darker periods after the divorce. "You're living. There's a difference. Smart kid. Smarter than her old man, that was certain." The drive to the VA center took 20 minutes through Denver's morning traffic. Gavin's truck, a modified Ford F-150 with hand controls, handled like a dream. Another piece of adaptive equipment that had gradually transformed from necessity to preference. Behind the wheel, his disability became invisible. Behind the wheel, he was just another guy heading to work. The Veterans Affairs Medical Center buzzed with its usual morning energy. Gavin had been working as a counselor here for 3 years, helping younger vets navigate the minefield of civilian life after military service. It wasn't the career he'd planned that had ended in a cloud of dust and shrapnel outside Kandahar, but it gave him purpose. His first appointment was with Marcus Rodriguez, a 24-year-old Marine who'd lost both legs to an IED 6 months ago. Kid was struggling with the same demons that had once consumed Gavin. "I don't see the point," Marcus said, slumped in the wheelchair he refused to customize or personalize. "What kind of life is this? I can't even." He gestured helplessly at his missing legs. Gavin leaned forward, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came from lived experience. "You know what I thought the day they fitted me with this thing?" He tapped his prosthetic. "I thought my daughter would never look at me the same way again. Thought I'd lost the right to call myself her father." Marcus looked up, something flickering in his eyes. "She was 16 then. Now she's getting married tomorrow, and you know what? She asked me to walk her down the aisle." not ride in a wheelchair, not have someone else do it, walk. Gavin's smile was soft but firm. The legs don't define us, son. What we do despite losing them, that's what matters. They talked for another 40 minutes, working through Marcus's frustration and fear. When the young Marine left, there was something different in his posture, not hope, exactly, but maybe the possibility of hope. Gavin's phone buzzed as he was updating Marcus's file. Emma's name flashed on the screen, along with a photo he'd taken of her laughing at last Christmas. "Hey, sweetheart." "Dad." Her voice carried that mix of excitement and stress that seemed to define brides to be. "Please tell me you're packed and ready. Your flight's at 3, right?" "All set," he lied, knowing his suitcase sat empty on his bedroom floor. "How are you holding up?" A pause. "I'm scared you won't make it, not because of the flight," she added quickly. "I know you'll be there. Airports are hard for you. And I hate that my wedding is adding to your stress." The guilt in her voice hit him like a physical blow. This was exactly what he'd feared when her PTSD symptoms had gotten worse. After the divorce, that Emma would start taking responsibility for his struggles. "Emma Catherine Walton," he said, using her full name with mock sternness. "The only thing stressing me about tomorrow is whether Thomas is good enough for you. And we both know he's not." She laughed, the sound carrying across the miles and lightening something in his chest. "Dad, he's a good man," Gavin admitted, "even if he doesn't understand why I keep all my shoes tied in double knots." Military precision. "In civilian life, something like that." He paused, gathering the words that felt too big for a phone conversation. "Emma, I need you to know how proud I am, not just of tomorrow, but of who you've become. You're stronger than both your parents put together. I learned from the best." Her voice was softer now. "I love you, Dad. Love you too, kiddo. See you tomorrow." After hanging up, Gavin sat in his office for a long moment, staring at the photo on his desk. Emma at her college graduation, beaming beside her old man in his dress uniform. Before the injury, before everything changed, the packing took longer than it should have. Each item required consideration beyond the usual travel logistics: extra medication, documentation for the prosthetic, backup equipment, the letter from his doctor explaining his condition. Though he'd learned that official paperwork meant little to certain types of authority figures, airport security had become one of his biggest challenges since losing his leg. The metal detectors, the additional screening, the suspicious looks from TSA agents who seemed to view his disability as a potential threat, rather than a sacrifice made in service to his country. He'd developed strategies over the years. Arrive early, stay calm, remember that most people were just doing their jobs. But it never got easier. The drive to Denver International Airport gave him time to mentally prepare. The crowds would be thick, voices echoing off high ceilings in ways that sometimes triggered memories of the marketplace in Kandahar, the moment before the IED detonated, when the world had been full of sound and movement, and then suddenly, violently, full of nothing at all. Gavin gripped the steering wheel tighter, forcing himself to focus on the present. Tomorrow, he would walk his daughter down the aisle. Tomorrow, he would keep the promise he'd made to himself in that hospital bed 6 years ago that his injury wouldn't steal the moments that mattered most. The airport terminal rose ahead of him, glass and steel gleaming in the afternoon sun. He found a parking spot and sat for a moment, gathering his resolve the way he'd once gathered his gear before. A patrol. Just another mission tank, he whispered to himself. Get through security. Get on the plane. Get to Emma. He shouldered his bag and started the walk toward the terminal entrance, his prosthetic clicking softly against the concrete with each step. The automatic doors slid open, and the familiar cacophony of airport noise washed over him. Announcements, conversations, the rumble of rolling luggage. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a part of him that had been honed by years of combat experience registered the subtle signs of potential trouble. The way certain people in uniform carried themselves, the tension in some faces that suggested power held too tightly, the atmosphere that could shift from routine to confrontational without warning. But Gavin pushed those thoughts aside. This was just a trip to his daughter's wedding, a simple journey from point A to point B. What could possibly go wrong? He joined the line for security screening. unaware that his quiet dignity and visible disability had already caught the attention of someone who viewed both as challenges to be met with authority rather than respect. The day that would change everything was just beginning. The sharp crack of simulated gunfire echoed across the training facility as Captain Sarah Phoenix Hill watched her team move through the urban warfare scenario with practiced precision. 40 miles outside Denver, the private military contractor facility looked like a small town that had been purpose-built for conflict. Concrete buildings riddled with strategic openings, kill houses designed to test reflexes and decision-making. Under pressure, contact left. Lieutenant James "Bulldog" Morrison's voice crackled through the comm system as he pivoted, his rifle tracking smoothly toward the pop-up target. At 28, Bulldog still carried the aggressive energy that had made him both an asset and a concern during their deployment days. That same intensity that had nearly gotten him killed when he'd charged ahead of the squad in Kandahar. Forcing Tank to Sarah cut off that line of thinking. Some memories were better left alone, especially during training exercises. Clean sweep, Phoenix, came the calm voice of Sergeant Mike Wrench O'Brien from his overwatch position. Bulldog's getting antsy though. Kid's been hitting targets like he's got something to prove. Sarah keyed her mic. All units, scenario complete. Weapons safe, return to briefing area. The team emerged from the kill house with the fluid movements of soldiers who'd operated together for years. Staff Sergeant Rita "Doc" Williams checked her gear with methodical precision, her combat medic training evident in the way she inventoried her supplies even after a training run. Wrench descended from his sniper perch with the unhurried efficiency that had earned him his nickname, the man who could fix anything, from helicopter engines to complicated tactical problems. But it was Bulldog who concerned Sarah. The young Marine moved with barely contained energy, his jaw tight with frustration that had nothing to do with the training exercise. Good runs today, Sarah announced as they gathered in the briefing room. Response times are improving. Communication was clear. Bulldog, nice work on that corner clearing sequence. Would have been better with Tank there, Bulldog muttered, stripping off his tactical gloves. He taught me that move. Said the key was reading the space before you entered it, not just charging in like some hot-headed Marine. Doc finished with a knowing smile. Pretty sure those were his exact words. The mention of their former sergeant settled over the group like a familiar weight. Tank Gavin Walton had been more than their squad leader during their Afghanistan deployment. He'd been the steady presence that kept Bulldog from getting himself killed, the tactical mind that got them through impossible situations, the father figure who'd somehow managed to care for each of them while carrying his own burdens. Sarah pulled up the briefing materials for their next contract on her tablet, but her heart wasn't in it. 3 years since they'd transitioned from military service to private contracting, and sometimes the work felt like a poor substitute for what they'd once had. Better money, sure, more autonomy, but something was missing, the sense of purpose that came from serving something larger than themselves. Our next deployment is Colombia, she began, cycling through satellite images and intelligence reports. Corporate security for an energy company, standard protection detail. But the local situation is fluid. Wrench leaned back in his chair, his weathered face thoughtful. What's the real story? These energy companies don't usually need military contractors for standard anything. FARC remnants have been hitting infrastructure sites. Our job is to keep their executives breathing while they negotiate mineral rights. Sarah's voice carried the professional neutrality she'd perfected, but internally, she wrestled with the same moral complexity that plagued all of them. They were good at what they did, protecting people, solving problems with surgical precision. But corporate profit margins weren't exactly the same as defending democracy. Bulldog stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the training grounds. Remember when Tank used to say that every mission had to pass the mirror test? Could you look at yourself afterward and be proud of what you'd done? Tank said a lot of things, Doc replied quietly. He also said that sometimes you have to work within the system you've got, not the one you want. Sarah checked her phone, a habit she'd developed ever since Gavin had started sharing his location with the team. It was his way of staying connected without having to ask for help. Typical Tank. trying to take care of everyone else while managing his own struggles. The GPS showed him at Denver International Airport. "He's flying out today," she said, holding up the phone. "Emma's wedding is tomorrow." The mood in the room shifted instantly. They all knew what travel meant for Gavin: the anxiety, the crowds, the security procedures that turned routine trips into endurance tests. His PTSD had improved over the years, but airports remained one of his biggest triggers. "Should have offered to drive him," Bulldog said, his frustration now clearly directed at himself. "Guy saved my life, and I let him face that airport nightmare alone." "He wouldn't have accepted," Sarah replied, though she felt the same guilt. "You know, Tank doesn't want to be anyone's burden." Doc snorted. "Burden? The man who carried me 3 miles with a separated shoulder after that IED hit our convoy. Who talked Bulldog through his first panic attack. Who made sure Wrench's sister got survivor benefits when the VA tried to deny them." She shook her head. "If he's a burden, we could all use more like him." Sarah remembered the day Gavin had been injured. Not just the explosion, though. That image would never leave her, but the moment in the hospital, when he'd insisted on briefing her about each team member's condition, before allowing the doctors to work on him, even with his leg mangled beyond saving. His first concern had been for his people. That's when she'd known she wanted to follow him anywhere. The fact that she'd ended up leading them instead felt like wearing someone else's uniform. "The Columbia contract can wait," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the decision. "I want to run another scenario: urban environment, civilian protection." Wrench raised an eyebrow. "We just finished. Humor me." Sarah was already moving toward the equipment lockers. "Sometimes you need to remember why you learned to fight in the first place." As they geared up again, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her contact at Blackwater Solutions, confirming their deployment timeline for South America. Big money, clean extraction after 6 months, everything their business plan required. But watching her team prepare for another training run, Bulldog checking his weapon with the precision Tank had drilled into him, Doc organizing her medical kit with the care Tank had taught her, Wrench calculating angles and distances the way Tank had shown him. Sarah felt the familiar pull of something deeper than profit margins. These people weren't just her employees, they were her brothers and sisters, forged in the same crucible that had shaped them all under Tank's leadership. Whatever they did, wherever they went, that bond remained stronger than any contract. "Phoenix, we're ready," Bulldog called out, his earlier frustration replaced by focused professionalism. Sarah grabbed her gear and joined them, pushing thoughts of moral complexity aside for now. There would be time later to figure out the balance between survival and service, between making a living and making a difference. For now, they had training to complete and skills to maintain. Because somewhere out there, Tank was navigating his own battlefield. And if experience had taught them anything, it was that veterans like them needed to be ready for anything. The afternoon sun slanted through the facility's windows as they moved toward the next scenario, unaware that within hours, their training would transform from preparation to desperate necessity. The afternoon sun slanted through the terminal's massive windows as Gavin approached the TSA checkpoint, his carry-on bag slung over his shoulder and his boarding pass clutched in his hand. The familiar weight of anxiety settled in his chest as he surveyed the security lines, not the sharp panic of his worst days, but the steady tension that came with knowing he was about to be scrutinized, questioned, and likely delayed. He chose the leftmost line, noting that it moved at a steady pace and was staffed by agents who seemed focused on their jobs rather than exerting authority. Small victories mattered in situations like this. "Next," called the TSA agent checking documents, a young Latina woman whose name tag read M. Santos. She had kind eyes and moved with the efficient professionalism of someone still taking her job seriously. When Gavin approached, she glanced at his boarding pass and ID with practiced speed. "Traveling to Sacramento today, Mr. Walton." "Yes." "Ma'am, my daughter's wedding tomorrow." The words came out easier than expected, pride overriding anxiety for a moment. Agent Santos smiled, genuine warmth breaking through her professional demeanor. "Congratulations, that's wonderful." She handed back his documents. "Please proceed to the security screening area." The metal detector loomed ahead, its archway looking more like a medical device than a security measure. Gavin had learned to approach it methodically. Remove everything metal, explain his situation clearly, be patient with the process. He placed his bag on the conveyor belt, removed his watch and belt, and prepared for the conversation he'd had dozens of times before. "Sir, please step through the detector," called a different agent, this one older and broader, with sergeant's stripes tattooed on his forearm and eyes that seemed to be searching for trouble. "I need to inform you that I have a prosthetic leg," Gavin said clearly, keeping his voice calm and respectful. "I have documentation from my doctor, and I'm prepared for additional screening if necessary." The agent, Derek Walsh, according to his name tag, looked up from his scanner with an expression that immediately put Gavin on edge. It was the look of someone who viewed accommodation requests as personal challenges to his authority. "Why, step through," Walsh ordered curtly, making no acknowledgement of Gavin's explanation. The detector's alarm sounded immediately, the harsh beeping echoing through the checkpoint area. Gavin had expected this. It happened every time, despite the advances in prosthetic technology. He remained calm, hands visible, waiting for the standard secondary screening procedure. "Sir, step back through and try again," Walsh commanded, his voice carrying an edge that suggested he believed Gavin was somehow trying to game the system. "The alarm is from my prosthetic leg," Gavin explained patiently. "I have medical documentation." I said step through again. The second attempt produced the same result, the alarm's shrill beeping drawing attention from other passengers. Gavin noticed people beginning to stare, their expressions ranging from curiosity to impatience. A businessman checking his watch, a mother pulling her children closer, an elderly couple whispering to each other. Agent Santos appeared at Walsh's shoulder, her expression concerned. "Derek," he mentioned a prosthetic. I'll handle this," Walsh cut her off, his tone suggesting that her input wasn't welcome. He turned back to Gavin with barely concealed hostility. "Sir, I need you to remove any metal objects and step through one more time." "I've already removed everything I can," Gavin replied, his military training keeping his voice level despite the growing frustration. "The prosthetic leg is permanently attached. I have documentation from my physician and the VA that explains. Are you refusing to comply with security procedures?" The question hit Gavin like a slap. In his peripheral vision, he could see more passengers stopping to watch, phones being pulled from pockets. The familiar tightness in his chest that signaled the onset of anxiety began to build. "I'm not refusing anything," he said carefully. "I'm trying to explain that I have a medical device that will set off your detector. I'm prepared for additional screening, pat-downs, whatever protocols you have in place." Walsh stepped closer, his posture aggressive. "A lot of people claim to have medical conditions when they're trying to smuggle contraband. How do I know that prosthetic isn't hiding something?" The words struck Gavin with unexpected force. 6 years of living with his disability, 6 years of explaining and accommodating, and maintaining dignity in the face of ignorance, and this man was suggesting he was using his sacrifice as a cover for criminal activity. "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan," Gavin said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of controlled emotion. "I lost this leg saving 3 soldiers from an IED explosion. I'm not trying to smuggle anything. I'm trying to get to my daughter's wedding." But Walsh wasn't backing down. If anything, the mention of military service seemed to fuel his aggression. "Yeah, well, I don't see any uniform, far as I'm concerned. You're just another passenger trying to skip the rules." Agent Santos moved closer, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the confrontation. "Derek, maybe we should call a supervisor." I said, "I'm handling this." Walsh's voice had risen enough that passengers in neighboring lines were turning to watch. "Sir, either you comply with standard screening procedures or you don't fly today. It's that simple." Gavin felt the familiar sensation of the world tilting slightly, the way it did when his PTSD began to activate. The hostile voice, the aggressive posture, the sense of being surrounded and scrutinized, it all echoed memories of markets in Kandahar, of checkpoints where the wrong word or movement could mean the difference between life and death. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" he managed. his hands slightly raised in a gesture that was both compliance and surrender. "Remove the prosthetic for inspection." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Remove his prosthetic, here, in front of hundreds of passengers. Strip away the medical device that allowed him to walk, that gave him dignity, that represented years of painful rehabilitation and adjustment. "Sir," Agent Santos interjected, her voice carrying urgency. "That's not standard procedure. We have protocols for. The prosthetic gets inspected or he doesn't fly," Walsh declared, his voice now loud enough that the entire security area could hear. "Those are the rules." Gavin closed his eyes for a moment, fighting against the rising tide of humiliation and anger. When he opened them, he saw the faces watching him, some sympathetic, others impatient, a few openly recording with their phones. He thought of Emma, waiting for him in Sacramento. He thought of the promise he'd made to walk her down the aisle. "I'll need somewhere private," he said quietly, hating himself for the words even as he spoke them. Walsh's smile was sharp and unpleasant. "No special accommodations. You want to fly, you follow the same rules as everyone else." The checkpoint had grown quiet, except for the continued beeping of metal detectors processing other passengers. Gavin stood, frozen in the moment, his military training warring with his human dignity, his love for his daughter battling against his refusal to be humiliated. Behind the security barrier, Agent Santos caught the eye of another supervisor, her expression clearly communicating distress. But Walsh was on a power trip now, his authority unchallenged, his hostility toward this disabled veteran flowing from some deep well of personal resentment. "What's it gonna be?" Walsh demanded, stepping even closer. "You gonna comply? Or do I need to call for additional security?" Gavin felt something crack inside him, not break, but crack. The careful control he'd maintained, the dignity he'd fought to preserve, the calm professionalism that had gotten him through countless difficult situations. For the first time since his injury, he felt truly helpless. And that's when Derek Walsh made the decision that would change everything. "Security to checkpoint 3. Derek Walsh's voice carried across the terminal with vindictive satisfaction. As he keyed his radio, "Need assistance with a non-compliant passenger." Gavin felt the world narrow to a tunnel as two additional TSA officers approached, their hands resting casually on equipment belts that suddenly seemed far too similar to the gear worn by soldiers in hostile territory. The familiar taste of copper filled his mouth, a phantom sensation his brain conjured whenever stress triggered memories of that last patrol in Kandahar. "Sir, I'm complying," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor he could feel building in his hands. "I just need you to understand that what you're asking, what I'm asking," Walsh interrupted, stepping close enough that Gavin could smell coffee on his breath, "is for you to follow the same security procedures as everyone else. No special treatment because you claim to be some kind of war hero." The word claim hit like a physical blow. Round them, the checkpoint had become a theater, passengers openly staring and recording as the situation escalated beyond anything resembling normal security screening. Gavin caught sight of Agent Santos near the metal detector, her face pale with obvious distress, as she watched her supervisor's behavior spiral beyond procedure and into something darker. "Mr. Walton," one of the arriving officers said, his tone more professional but equally firm, "we need you to step aside for additional screening. Please come with us." Gavin nodded, grateful for a voice that didn't carry Walsh's hostility. He moved toward the indicated area, but Walsh wasn't finished asserting his dominance. "No," Walsh commanded, blocking Gavin's path. "He removes the prosthetic here, now, or he doesn't fly. Those are the rules." "Derek," Agent Santos stepped forward, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "That's not we have private screening areas for. Are you questioning my authority, Santos?" Walsh's head snapped toward her, his eyes blazing with the fury of a petty tyrant whose power had been challenged. "Because I can make sure you spend the rest of your probationary period on baggage duty." Agent Santos fell silent, but Gavin could see the war playing out on her face. She knew this was wrong. Everyone knew this was wrong. But Walsh held the power here, and power without accountability was a dangerous weapon. "Sir," the backup officer tried again, "let's just move to A. I said here and now. Walsh's voice had risen to the point where it carried across multiple security lines. Either this man complies with standard screening procedures, or he gets removed from the premises. It's that simple. The word removed triggered something primal in Gavin's nervous system. Suddenly he wasn't standing in a Denver airport, but crouched behind a concrete barrier in Kandahar. The acrid smell of burning fuel in his nostrils. The sound of incoming mortar rounds echoing off buildings. His breathing shifted, becoming shallow and rapid. I need a moment, he managed, his hand moving instinctively to steady himself against a nearby wall. Walsh interpreted the movement as defiance. No more delays. Officer Martinez. Officer Chen removed this individual from the checkpoint. Wait, Agent Santos said, stepping between the officers and Gavin. He's having a medical episode. Look at him. But Gavin was no longer fully present in the airport terminal. The fluorescent lights had become the harsh glare of desert sun. The echoing voices, the chaotic shouting that had preceded the IED explosion. His prosthetic leg felt foreign and unstable, the way it had in those first terrible weeks after the amputation, when phantom pain convinced him that his missing limb was still attached and burning. Sir, can you hear me? Agent Santos's voice seemed to come from very far away. Mr. Walton, get him out of here, Walsh ordered, his patience exhausted. I don't care if he's having a breakdown. He's disrupting airport security. The two backup officers exchanged uncertain glances. Officer Martinez, a veteran himself based on his bearing, seemed to recognize the signs of PTSD activation. Derek, maybe we should. I gave you an order. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When the officers moved toward him, Gavin's training kicked in, not his TSA compliance training, but his combat instincts. His body tensed, muscles coiling in preparation for fight or flight, even as his rational mind screamed that this was an airport, not a battlefield. Don't touch me, he said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to life or death situations. Please, just don't touch me. But Walsh had moved beyond reason into pure vindictive pleasure. Grab him. The moment Officer Chen's hand closed around Gavin's arm, something fundamental broke. The touch, combined with the hostile voices and the sense of being trapped, completed the circuit that transported him fully back to Afghanistan. He was no longer a disabled veteran trying to reach his daughter's wedding. He was a soldier under attack, surrounded by hostiles. His team in danger. Contact, the word erupted from him with startling volume. Military terminology that had no place in a civilian airport. He jerked away from the officer's grip, stumbling as his prosthetic failed to provide the stability his panicked brain expected. The stumble sent him to one knee, and that's when Walsh made his final, catastrophic mistake. Take him down. Officer Martinez hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the escalation. But Officer Chen moved forward to comply. When he grabbed Gavin's shoulders to pull him upright, Gavin's PTSD-fueled reflexes took over completely. He twisted away, lost his balance entirely, and crashed to the terminal floor, the sound of his body hitting the ground hard, awkward. His prosthetic leg twisted beneath him, cut through the ambient airport noise like a gunshot. Around the checkpoint, conversations stopped. Children stared. Business travelers lowered their phones from their faces to their hands, some switching to video mode to capture what was becoming a viral moment. Get him up, Walsh commanded, but now his voice carried less certainty. The optics of 3 TSA officers manhandling a disabled veteran on the ground were starting to penetrate even his authority-drunk consciousness. Agent Santos broke protocol completely, dropping to her knees beside Gavin. Sir, you're in Denver International Airport. You're safe. Can you hear me? Gavin's eyes were wide and unfocused, his breathing ragged. In his mind, he was back in that marketplace, the smell of burning plastic and human flesh filling his nostrils, the weight of his rifle familiar in hands that now shook against the airport's cold floor. Tank, he called out, using his own call sign in confusion. Tank to base, we're taking fire. Need immediate. The desperation in his voice, the obvious trauma response, should have stopped everything. should have triggered emergency medical protocols, supervisor intervention, basic human decency. Instead, Walsh doubled down. "I don't care if he's crazy," he snarled. "Get him out of my checkpoint," as the officers moved to comply. As passengers continued recording, as Agent Santos fought back tears of frustration and shame, Gavin's hand found the emergency alert device on his cane, a simple button connected to an app that would ping his location and a distress signal to a preset list of contacts. Through the haze of his PTSD episode, through the humiliation and fear and crushing sense of helplessness, one thought penetrated. Emma. He had to get to Emma. He pressed the button, 40 miles away. In a briefing room at a private military contractor facility, Captain Sarah Phoenix Hill's phone buzzed with an incoming alert. The message was simple: Emergency Gavin. Walton, Denver International Airport, TSA Checkpoint 3, assistance required. Sarah stared at the screen for exactly 3 seconds, her mind processing the implications with the speed of someone trained to make life or death decisions under pressure. Then she was moving, shouting orders to her team, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never forgotten that some things mattered more than rules, regulations, or consequences. The cavalry was coming. The alert tone on Sarah's phone cut through the briefing room's casual conversation like a blade. She looked down at the screen, read the message once, then read it again to make sure her eyes weren't playing tricks on her. Emergency Gavin Walton, Denver International Airport, TSA Checkpoint 3, assistance required. The device clattered to the table as Sarah shot to her feet, her chair spinning backward from the force of her movement. Every eye in the room locked onto her face, reading the shift from casual leadership to combat mode in her expression. "Tank's in trouble," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority that had gotten them through firefights in Kandahar. "Dia, Checkpoint 3, emergency alert." The transformation was instantaneous. Bulldog's jaw tightened, his hands automatically checking for gear that wasn't there. Doc's medical training kicked in, her mind already running through potential scenarios. Wrench straightened in his chair, his engineer's brain calculating distances and logistics. "What kind of trouble?" Doc asked, already moving toward her equipment bag. Sarah was pulling up maps on her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen. "Don't know. But Tank doesn't hit that button unless it's serious." She looked up at her team, her family, and saw the same determination reflected in each face that she felt burning in her chest. "We're 40 minutes out by road, 20 by air. The Black Hawk's still at the facility," Wrench said, his voice calm but urgent. "Fueled and ready. I can have us airborne in 10 minutes. Bulldog was already strapping on his sidearm, his movements sharp with barely controlled aggression. "TSA checkpoint. Has to be security theater gone wrong. Some rent-a-cop decided to hassle the wrong veteran." "We don't know that," Sarah cautioned, even as her own mind was running through similar scenarios. She'd witnessed Tank's struggles with airports, the way routine security procedures could trigger his PTSD. The man who'd once led them through the most dangerous territory in Afghanistan could be undone by fluorescent lights and hostile voices. Doc grabbed her medical kit, her training making her think worst-case scenarios. If he's having an episode, if they're treating it as a security threat instead of a medical emergency. She didn't need to finish the sentence. They'd all seen how civilians, especially those with limited training and unlimited authority, could escalate situations involving veterans with PTSD. What should be de-escalation and medical intervention too often became confrontation and control. Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming call from their flight coordinator. She answered without preamble. "Phoenix, this is Air Control. We show you're scheduled for a maintenance flight in 2 hours. You need to change of plans," Sarah interrupted, already moving toward the equipment lockers. "Emergency divert to Denver International. Authorization Phoenix Alpha 7. "Ma'am, I don't show any authorized." "Then you better get authorization, because we're wheels up in 8 minutes. Sarah's voice carried the kind of authority that didn't invite argument. "One of our people is in trouble." She ended the call and turned to face her team. They were gearing up with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who'd done this dance too many times to count. Not full combat load, this wasn't Afghanistan, but enough equipment to handle whatever they might face. Phoenix, Wrench said quietly, his hands steady as he checked his gear. You know this is career suicide, right? Unauthorized use of company aircraft. Potential violation of federal airspace regulations. Interfering with airport security. Sarah met his eyes, seeing not doubt but confirmation. Wrench was the most pragmatic member of their team. The one who calculated risks and weighed consequences. If he was asking the question, it meant he'd already run the numbers and was giving her one last chance to reconsider. You remember what Tank told us the day before that last patrol? She asked, her voice carrying the weight of shared memory. When Morrison wanted to call in sick because his girlfriend had broken up with him. Bulldog's head snapped up at the mention of his real name, his face flushing with the memory of his younger, more reckless self. He said that being part of a team meant showing up for each other, especially when it wasn't convenient. Doc recited, her voice soft but firm, that the moment you start calculating whether someone's worth the risk is the moment you stop being soldiers and start being mercenaries. Sarah nodded, slinging her rifle across her shoulder. Tanks never calculated our worth. Time to return. The favor, the walk to the helicopter pad took 3 minutes, but it felt like hours. Sarah's mind was running through tactical scenarios, contingency plans, legal ramifications. Using a private military contractor's aircraft for an unauthorized mission could result in federal charges, loss of their operating license, criminal prosecution. Everything they'd built since leaving the military could disappear. But every time doubt crept in, she remembered Tank's voice during that counseling session she'd witnessed at the VA hospital. A young Marine with fresh amputation scars, angry and lost, asking what the point was of surviving if you couldn't really live. The point, Tank had said with quiet conviction, is that survival is just the first step. What you do with the life you've saved, that's what gives it meaning. The Black Hawk sat on the tarmac like a sleeping predator, all sharp angles and military efficiency. Wrench was already running his pre-flight checks, his hands moving with the confidence of someone who'd kept aircraft flying in the worst conditions imaginable. ETA to DIA, Sarah asked, strapping into the co-pilot's seat. 18 minutes. Depending on air traffic control cooperation. Wrench's fingers danced across the controls, bringing systems online. Assuming they don't scramble fighters to intercept us. They won't. Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. We're not showing hostile intent. Just emergency response. Bulldog's voice crackled through the calm system from the passenger compartment. Phoenix, you want to tell us what the plan is once we land? Because I'm pretty sure DIA security doesn't just let military contractors waltz onto the tarmac. Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching the landscape blur past as Wrench lifted them into the afternoon sky. The plan was simple in concept, potentially catastrophic in execution. Land at one of the world's busiest airports, without authorization, confront whatever situation had triggered Tank's emergency alert, and extract their former squad leader from what was probably a federal incident. We land, we assess, we adapt, she said finally, using Tank's own tactical philosophy. And we bring our brother home. Copy that, Phoenix, came Doc's voice, steady and sure. For Tank, the others echoed, the words carrying the weight of absolute commitment. Below them, Denver International Airport grew larger. On the horizon, its distinctive peaked roof looking like a series of white mountains against the Colorado landscape. Somewhere in that massive complex, Tank was facing whatever demons had triggered his alert alone. Probably scared, definitely. Outnumbered, but not for much longer. Sarah keyed her radio to air traffic control frequency, knowing that the next few minutes would either be the finest moment of her military career or the beginning of its end. Denver approach. This is military contractor aircraft Black Hawk 77 requesting emergency landing. Priority traffic. The response crackled back immediately, confusion evident in the controller's voice. Black Hawk 77, negative on emergency authorization. Divert to negative. Denver approach. We have a veteran in crisis at your facility. We're coming in. Sarah switched off the radio, cutting off the stream of protests and threats emanating from the control tower. Whatever happened, Next, they were committed. The point of no return had passed the moment Tank's alert reached her phone. Everything else was just details. The security office felt like a cell, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows that made everything look sterile and cold. Gavin sat in a plastic chair that was bolted to the floor, his hands resting on his knees as he tried to center himself. In the present moment, the prosthetic leg that had caused all the trouble stretched out at an awkward angle, a constant reminder of both his sacrifice and his current humiliation. His breathing had finally returned to normal, the hyperventilation and phantom pain from his PTSD episode gradually subsiding. But the shame burned hotter than any physical discomfort. 42 years old, a decorated combat veteran, and he'd been dragged across an airport terminal floor like a common criminal, while dozens of people recorded every moment. Through the office's small window, he could see the checkpoint continuing to operate normally. Passengers flowing through the metal detectors as if nothing had happened, as if a man's dignity hadn't been stripped away 15 feet from where they now stood in line, checking their phones and complaining about delays. The door opened and Airport Director Carol Hutchinson entered, followed by Derek Walsh, whose swagger had diminished considerably in the past 30 minutes. Behind them came a woman in a TSA supervisor's uniform who introduced herself as Agent Martinez, not to be confused with Officer Martinez, who had tried to de-escalate the situation. "Mr. Walton," Carol began, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of an administrator who already suspected she was dealing with a public relations disaster. "I'm Carol Hutchinson, Director of Operations here at DIA. I want to apologize for any inconvenience you may have experienced during your security screening." Inconvenience. The word hung in the air like an insult. Gavin met her eyes steadily, recognizing the calculated language of damage control. "Ma'am," he replied quietly, "with respect, being physically dragged across your terminal floor while having a PTSD episode isn't an inconvenience. It's a civil rights violation." Derek Walsh shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado replaced by the nervous energy of someone beginning to realize the magnitude of his mistake. "Now hold on. This individual was non-compliant with standard security procedures. He refused to." "I refused nothing," Gavin interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel. "I explained that I had a prosthetic leg, offered to provide medical documentation, and requested appropriate accommodation. Your agent demanded that I remove a permanently attached medical device in public view, then had me physically restrained. When I experienced a trauma response." Agent Martinez was taking notes, her expression growing more troubled with each word. Carol Hutchinson's face had gone pale as she began to understand the legal implications of what had occurred. "Mr. Walsh," she said carefully, "perhaps you could walk me through your decision-making process during this incident." But before Derek could respond, Agent Santos appeared in the doorway, her face flushed with emotion and determination. "Director Hutchinson, I need to report what I witnessed at Checkpoint 3. Her voice carried the shakiness of someone stepping far outside their comfort zone, but her words were clear and steady. Agent Walsh violated multiple protocols and ignored proper procedures for accommodating disabled passengers. Derek's face reddened. "Santos, you're out of line. I was following standard. You ordered a disabled veteran to remove his prosthetic leg in public view," Maria Santos continued, her voice growing stronger. "You refused to allow private screening, ignored his medical documentation, and escalated a routine accommodation into a physical confrontation. I have it all documented, and I'm prepared to testify to what I witnessed." Through the window, Gavin could see passengers still moving through the checkpoint, many of them glancing toward the security office with curious expressions. But something else was happening. People were checking their phones, pointing toward the terminal's main windows, their faces showing surprise and confusion. Carol Hutchinson's radio crackled to life. "Director Hutchinson, to the operations center immediately. We have an unscheduled military helicopter requesting emergency landing on airport property." "I'm sorry, what?" Carol keyed her radio. "Repeat that." "Military Black Hawk helicopter, ma'am. They're requesting immediate landing authorization for what they're calling a veteran emergency response." Air traffic control is trying to divert them, but they're not responding to instructions. Through the office window, Gavin could see people throughout the terminal pointing toward the sky, their phones raised to capture whatever was happening outside. A security officer knocked on the door, his expression urgent. "Director, you need to see this. There's a helicopter approaching the airport, and social media is going crazy about the security incident." Carol Hutchinson looked from the radio to her phone, which was now buzzing with incoming calls. Her face showed the dawning realization that what had started as a routine security screening was spiraling into something far beyond her experience. "Mr. Walsh," she said quietly, "you're suspended pending investigation. Please report to Human Resources immediately." Derek's mouth opened and closed like a fish, his authority evaporating in real time. "You can't. I was following procedures." "You were following no procedures I recognize." Agent Martinez interrupted, her supervisor's insignia giving weight to her words. "TSA policy clearly states that passengers with prosthetic devices are to be offered private screening options. Your actions today violated federal disability accommodation laws and basic human decency." As Derek was escorted from the office, his bluster finally cracking into something resembling panic, Carol turned back to Gavin with an expression that mixed professional concern with genuine remorse. Mr. Walton, please understand what happened today doesn't reflect our airport's values or policies. We're launching a full investigation, and I promise personally that corrective action will follow." Gavin nodded, but his eyes drifted to the crowd gathering at the terminal windows. Passengers were pressed against the glass, phones raised, recording something outside that had stirred the entire concourse. A security officer approached Carol Hutchinson, the airport director, with urgency. "Director, there's a helicopter requesting to land on the emergency access road. They're identifying as a private military contractor responding to a veteran in crisis." Gavin's mind clicked into sharp focus, the distress signal he'd activated during his PTSD episode. The military chopper now bearing down on the airport. The timing wasn't a coincidence. "Phoenix," he whispered instinctively, Sarah's call sign. Suddenly, Carol's radio erupted with transmissions from air traffic control, federal aviation authorities, and airport security. In the middle of the chaos, one broadcast came in loud and clear. "Denver approach. This is Black Hawk 77. We're responding to the mistreatment of a decorated combat veteran at your facility. We're landing authorized or not, either. Clear a landing zone, or explain to the media why you blocked a rescue mission for a disabled veteran." Pandemonium rippled through the terminal. Travelers left security lines to gather at the windows. TSA agents abandoned their stations. News crews were setting up live broadcasts. Gavin sat motionless, stunned, and for the first time since losing his leg, felt something powerful, the certainty that his people were coming for him. Help was 18 minutes away and closing. It began with children pressed to the windows. Their excited pointing caught adults' attention, and soon the crowd swelled. "Mom, look. A real Army helicopter," a boy shouted, his face lit with wonder. Overhead, the Black Hawk approached with determined speed, cutting across the Colorado sky with unmistakable military precision. In the control tower, stress mounted. The crew had registered as civilian contractors, but their behavior and airspace entry broke every protocol. "Black Hawk 77, you're not cleared to land," the controller repeated sternly. "Divert to Buckley Air Force Base or face." Federal response. Back in the chopper, Sarah's voice came through, calm and steady. "We are responding to a humanitarian emergency involving a disabled veteran. Landing authorization is required immediately. Negative. Divert now or..." The transmission cut off. Sarah had switched frequencies. In the cockpit, she and Wrench coordinated seamlessly, recalling countless extractions in Afghanistan. "Landing zone," Wrench asked, hands steady on the controls. "Emergency access road on the east side. No aircraft. Close to the terminal. Clear media line of sight." "Media? This is going public whether we want it to or not. Better we shape the story than let someone else spin it." In the rear, Doc and Bulldog watched the terminal grow closer. The chosen landing site was clear and flanked by a growing crowd of spectators. Phoenix. Doc said into the comms, "We're about to have the whole airport watching us. You sure about this?" Sarah thought of Gavin call sign tank, probably isolated, humiliated, and unsure of what was happening. She remembered the missions where he'd carried their team literally and emotionally. "I'm sure." She answered. Inside the terminal, the scene had shifted from airport routine to media frenzy. Passengers dropped bags and rushed the windows, filming the helicopter's approach. Security agents struggled to maintain order, torn between protocol and curiosity. Some abandoned their duties entirely. Carol Hutchinson's radio was alive with voices, federal agencies demanding answers, her staff reporting crowd issues, and controllers escalating airspace concerns. "Director," her ops manager interrupted. "We need to make a call on terminal operations. People are walking away from screening. It's chaos." Through the window of the security office, Gavin watched the helicopter approach, emotions surging. It wasn't a memory of combat it triggered, but rescue, safety, brotherhood, the feeling of being brought home. Carol stood beside him, abandoning her radio. "Mr. Walton," she said softly, eyes fixed on the descending aircraft. "Do you know who's in that helicopter?" "My family," Gavin replied simply. The Black Hawk touched down on the emergency access road with the gentle precision of a surgeon's scalpel, its landing so smooth that observers barely saw the moment of contact. The rotor wash sent debris swirling across the tarmac and rattled the terminal windows, but Wrench's skill kept the aircraft stable and secure before the rotors had fully spun down. Sarah was out of the aircraft, her tactical gear and purposeful stride immediately identifying her as military personnel to anyone with combat experience. Doc and Bulldog followed, their movements coordinated and professional despite the irregular nature of their arrival. Airport security vehicles were already converging on their position, lights flashing and radios chattering with urgent communications. But Sarah ignored the approaching officials, instead walking directly toward the terminal's main entrance, with the confidence of someone accustomed to operating in hostile territory. A news crew apparently stationed at the airport for an unrelated story had redirected their cameras toward the helicopter landing, their reporter hastily adjusting her story to cover what was clearly a developing situation. "This is unprecedented," the reporter said into her microphone, trying to be heard over the helicopter noise. "A military aircraft has just landed at Denver International Airport. In what appears to be an unauthorized operation, we're seeing what look like military contractors approaching the terminal building." Through the terminal windows, passengers pressed against the glass as Sarah and her team approached the entrance. Children pointed in excitement while adults fumbled with their phones, trying to capture video of something they'd never seen before. Inside the security office, Derek Walsh, who had been lingering despite his suspension, watched the approaching figures with growing panic. The earlier bravado that had driven him to humiliate a disabled veteran evaporated as he began to understand that his actions had attracted the attention of people with the training and resources to hold him accountable. "They can't just walk in here," he said weakly to no one in particular. "This is federal property. They don't have jurisdiction." But jurisdiction was a legal concept, and what was walking toward the terminal entrance was something more fundamental: warriors coming to defend one of their own, backed by the kind of moral authority that superseded regulations and procedures. Sarah reached the terminal entrance and paused, looking up at the massive building where her former squad leader was being held. Through the glass, she could see the crowds watching her, the excitement and confusion visible on hundreds of faces. She keyed her radio one final time. "Denver operations. This is Captain Sarah Hill, Phoenix team leader. We're here for Gavin Walton. You can facilitate his release, or you can explain to the media why you're preventing veterans from helping. A disabled service member. Your choice." The thunder from above had landed. Now it was time to reclaim their brother. The automatic doors of the terminal slid open with a soft hiss as Sarah Hill crossed the threshold, followed by Doc and Bulldog in tight formation. The sudden quiet after the helicopter's rotor wash felt almost oppressive, broken only by the murmur of hundreds of passengers who had abandoned their travel routines. to witness something unprecedented. Sarah moved through the crowd with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to command, her tactical gear and bearing causing people to step aside instinctively. Behind her, Doc carried her medical kit with the ready alertness of a combat medic, while Bulldog's hand rested casually near his sidearm, not threatening, but unmistakably ready. Airport security converged on their position from multiple directions, but Sarah ignored them, instead approaching the information desk where a wide-eyed employee sat frozen behind her computer. "Terminal, I need to speak with your operations director immediately," Sarah said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that didn't invite argument. "We're here about Gavin Walton." "Ma'am, I don't," the employee stammered, clearly overwhelmed by the situation spiraling beyond her training. A senior TSA supervisor, Agent Martinez from earlier, appeared at Sarah's shoulder, her expression mixing professional concern with obvious relief. "Captain Hill, I'm Supervisor Martinez. Director Hutchinson is waiting for you in the security office with Mr. Walton." She gestured toward the checkpoint area. "If you'll follow me." As they moved through the terminal, the crowd parted before them like water, passengers pulling out phones to record the procession of military personnel walking through the civilian space. Children stared in open fascination while adults whispered urgently to each other, trying to piece together what was happening. Near the security checkpoint, Derek Walsh stood beside two airport police officers, his earlier confidence completely evaporated when he saw Sarah approaching. His face went pale. "You can't just storm in here," he said weakly, his voice carrying none of the authority he'd wielded against Gavin. "This is federal property. You don't have jurisdiction." Sarah stopped directly in front of him, her eyes cold as winter steel. She didn't speak immediately, instead letting her gaze move from his TSA badge to his face, reading him the way she'd once read hostile territories. "Agent Walsh," she said finally, her voice quiet but carrying absolute conviction, "you made a critical error in judgment today. You mistook a disabled combat veteran for someone who didn't have backup." Derek opened his mouth to respond, but Bulldog stepped forward, his presence suddenly filling the space between them. "This the piece of shit who dragged Tank across the floor." Bulldog's voice was conversational, almost friendly, but his eyes held the kind of promise that made Derek step backward involuntarily. "Stand down, Morrison," Sarah commanded softly, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely opposed to letting Bulldog express his opinion more physically. Doc moved past them toward the security office, her medical training taking priority over the confrontation. "Where is he?" Agent Martinez led them through the checkpoint, past the metal detectors where Agent Santos still stood at her post, her eyes bright with unshed tears of relief as she watched the cavalry arrive for the veteran she'd tried to protect. The security office door opened to reveal Carol Hutchinson standing beside a plastic chair, where Gavin sat, his prosthetic leg stretched out awkwardly, his hands resting on his knees in the careful stillness of someone managing trauma response. When he looked up and saw Sarah in the doorway, something fundamental shifted in his expression. The quiet dignity he'd maintained throughout his ordeal remained, but underneath it, relief flooded his features like sunrise after a long night. "Phoenix," he said simply, using her call sign with the same ease he'd once used to coordinate tactical movements in hostile territory. Sarah crossed the small room in 3 strides, dropping to one knee beside his chair and placing her hand on his shoulder, a gesture that was both military respect and profound personal affection. "Hey, Tank," she said softly, "heard you were having some trouble with the locals, despite everything, the humiliation, the PTSD episode, the public spectacle." Gavin smiled. "Nothing I couldn't handle, though the backup is appreciated." Doc was already conducting her assessment, checking his pupils for signs of concussion, examining the scrapes on his palms from when he'd hit the terminal floor, monitoring his breathing for lingering effects of the panic attack. "Vitals are good," she reported. "Some superficial abrasions, but the primary concern is psychological trauma from the incident." She looked directly at Carol Hutchinson. "This man needs medical evaluation and documentation of his injuries for legal purposes." Carol nodded quickly. clearly eager to demonstrate cooperation now that the situation had evolved beyond her control. "Of course, we'll arrange for immediate medical attention, and I want to assure you that we're conducting a full investigation. Investigations already concluded." Bulldog interrupted, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who'd witnessed the aftermath. "Your boy Walsh violated federal disability laws, TSA protocols, and basic human decency. Question isn't whether he's guilty, question is whether you're going to handle this internally or let it go federal." Through the office window, they could see the media presence growing. News vans were arriving at the terminal's perimeter, and the crowd of passengers watching through the windows had swelled to include airport employees, TSA agents, and what appeared to be every person in the immediate area. Sarah's radio crackled with Wrench's voice from the helicopter. "Phoenix, we've got FAA and Homeland Security inbound. Estimate 20 minutes before this becomes a federal incident with paperwork. That'll take years to sort out." Sarah looked at Gavin, then at Carol Hutchinson, calculating the rapidly evolving situation with the tactical awareness that had kept them alive in Afghanistan. "Director Hutchinson," she said formally, "here's what's going to happen. Mr. Walton is going to receive immediate medical attention, full documentation of this incident, and a written apology from this airport acknowledging the civil rights violations he experienced. Agent Walsh is going to face appropriate disciplinary action, and your staff is going to receive additional training on disability accommodation and veteran services." Carol nodded rapidly. "Absolutely. Whatever you need." "What we need," Sarah continued, "is for Mr. Walton to make his daughter's wedding tomorrow. So we're going to escort him to his gate, ensure he receives the respect and dignity he's earned through his service to this country, and see him safely onto his flight." She stood, helping Gavin to his feet with the practiced ease of someone who'd supported wounded comrades before. "And if anyone interferes with that process, they're going to discover that disabled doesn't mean defenseless, and that some veterans have friends with helicopters." As they prepared to leave the security office, Agent Santos appeared in the doorway, her face showing the determination of someone who'd found her courage at exactly the right moment. "Mr. Walton," she said quietly, "I documented everything, every protocol violation, every inappropriate action. When you're ready to file complaints, I'll testify to what I witnessed." Gavin reached out and squeezed her hand briefly. "Thank you. Takes courage to stand up when it matters." Behind them, Derek Walsh sat in a plastic chair that matched the one Gavin had occupied, but his posture was entirely different, slumped, defeated, suddenly understanding that his moment of petty tyranny had just cost him everything. The brotherhood that had carried them through the worst Afghanistan had to offer was walking their sergeant toward his gate, ready to ensure that nothing and no one would prevent him from walking his daughter down the aisle. Some bonds, they had just demonstrated, were stronger than regulations, procedures, or the small-minded cruelty of those who mistook authority for power. 24 hours later, Gavin stood at the foot of a sunlit aisle in a small chapel outside Sacramento, his dress uniform crisp despite the previous day's ordeal. The morning's events felt surreal, from the viral videos of airport security dragging a disabled veteran across the terminal floor to the dramatic helicopter landing that had dominated news cycles across the country. But none of that mattered. Now, what mattered was Emma, radiant in her grandmother's wedding dress, waiting at the far end of the aisle for her father to walk her toward her new life. "Ready, Dad?" she whispered, slipping her arm through his. Gavin looked down at his daughter, brilliant, compassionate, stronger than he'd ever been, and felt the weight of gratitude that had sustained him through the darkest moments after his injury. "More than ready, sweetheart." The music began, and they started their walk. Each step felt deliberate, measured, the click of his prosthetic against the chapel floor barely audible beneath the soft organ music. In the pews, he caught sight of familiar faces, Emma's friends from college, relatives he hadn't seen in years, and in the back row, wearing civilian clothes that couldn't quite hide their military bearing, Sarah and her team. Phoenix had kept her word. Not only had they ensured his safe passage through the airport, but they'd accompanied him to Sacramento, standing guard in their own quiet way to make sure nothing interfered with this moment. Thomas Mitchell stood at the altar in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his face showing the mixture of joy and nervousness appropriate for a groom. But Gavin also saw something else there, a new understanding, perhaps, of the bonds that connected veterans and the lengths they would go to protect one another. The ceremony was brief but beautiful, conducted by a chaplain who'd served with the army in Iraq and understood the significance of having Gavin's military family present. When Thomas and Emma exchanged vows, speaking of partnership and loyalty, and standing together through whatever challenges life might bring, Gavin felt an echo of the promises he'd once made to his own team to have each other's backs, to leave no one behind. The reception was held in the chapel's garden, string lights creating a warm glow as the sun set over the California hills. Gavin found himself at a table with Sarah's team, sharing stories and laughter that felt both familiar and strange after years of separation. "So," Doc said, raising her glass of champagne, to Tank, who managed to turn a routine airport trip into a federal incident and a viral sensation. "Check this out," Bulldog said, pulling up his phone to show them the latest social media updates. The hashtag veteran dignity is trending nationwide. 3 million views on the helicopter landing video alone. Wrench shook his head in amazement. "Never thought our little rescue mission would break the internet." But Sarah was watching Gavin's face, reading the complex emotions there. "You okay with all this attention?" Gavin was quiet for a moment, considering. The past 24 hours had transformed him from a private counselor into an unwitting symbol of veteran mistreatment and military loyalty. News outlets were calling for congressional hearings. Derek Walsh had been terminated and was facing federal civil rights charges. Airport policies nationwide were being reviewed. "It's not about me," he said finally. "If what happened yesterday helps other veterans avoid the same treatment, then maybe some good came out of it." "Dad," Emma peered at his shoulder, having changed from her wedding dress into a flowing blue gown. "Thomas and I wanted to thank you all for being here, and for," she gestured vaguely, trying to encompass the dramatic events of the previous day. Thomas joined them, his earlier nervousness replaced by genuine warmth. "I have to admit, when Emma told me about her father's military service, I thought I understood what that meant. Yesterday taught me I didn't have a clue." Sarah stood, extending her hand to Thomas. "Military families are complicated. We're loud, we're protective, and we take care of our own. Emma's part of that family now, which means so are you." Thomas shook her hand, his expression serious. "I'm honored to be included." As the evening progressed, Gavin found himself in conversations with wedding guests who'd seen the airport videos, each interaction reinforcing how far beyond his personal experience the incident had reached. A veteran's wife thanked him for highlighting airport accessibility issues. A college friend of Emma's said the videos had changed her perspective on veteran services. An elderly man quietly mentioned that he'd served in Vietnam and knew what it meant to be treated as a threat rather than a hero. Near midnight, as the reception wound down, Gavin stepped outside for air and found Agent Maria Santos waiting by the garden gate. She was out of uniform, wearing a simple dress, but her presence was unmistakable. "Mr. Walton, I hope you don't mind. Emma invited me. I wanted to see that you made it to your daughter's wedding." Gavin smiled, genuinely pleased. "To see her? Maria, you didn't have to come all this way." "Actually, I did." She pulled an envelope from her purse. "This is my formal statement about yesterday's incident, along with documentation of every protocol violation I witnessed. Derek Walsh is going to face criminal charges, and the airport is implementing new training programs." She paused, her voice becoming more personal. "My brother served in Iraq. He came home with PTSD and has trouble with crowds, authority figures, unexpected situations. What happened to you yesterday could happen to him, to any veteran. I couldn't let that slide." Gavin accepted the envelope, understanding the courage it had taken for her to speak up. "Thank you for standing up when it mattered." As Maria left, Sarah appeared beside him, following his gaze toward the chapel where Emma and Thomas were saying goodbye to their guests. "She's remarkable," Sarah said softly. "Emma, you raised an incredible daughter." "We did." Gavin corrected. "Her mother, me. The village that helped when I was too broken to be the father she needed. And in a way, all of you." Emma grew up knowing that family isn't just blood, it's the people who show up when everything falls apart. Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching the newlyweds embrace their friends and family. Yesterday, when I got your alert, I didn't hesitate. None of us did. Bulldog was ready to fight the entire TSA. Doc was already planning your medical care. Wrench was calculating flight paths before I finished explaining the situation. I know. Gavin said simply, the thing is, Tank, we needed to do it, not just for you, but for us. We've been drifting since we left the service, taking contracts that pay well but don't mean much. Yesterday reminded us who we are when it matters. Gavin turned to look at his former squad leader, seeing in her face the same search for purpose that had driven him to counseling work at the VA. What are you saying? I'm saying maybe it's time to find contracts that do more than pay the bills. Veterans advocacy, disability rights, the kind of work that would make Tank proud. Before Gavin could respond, Emma appeared at his side, her face glowing with happiness and exhaustion. Dad, Thomas, and I are heading to our hotel. But I wanted to tell you, seeing your team yesterday, watching them drop everything to help you, it reminded me why I'm so proud to be your daughter. She hugged him tightly, whispering in his ear, not because you're a war hero, but because you're the kind of man who inspires that kind of loyalty. That's the real victory. As the newlyweds departed and the reception finally ended, Gavin stood in the garden with his military family, looking up at stars that seemed brighter than usual. Tomorrow there would be interviews, legal proceedings, policy changes sparked by a moment when dignity and brotherhood had triumphed over bureaucratic cruelty. But tonight, there was just this: a father who'd walked his daughter down the aisle, surrounded by the people who'd proven that some bonds transcend time, distance, and institutional failure. The helicopter that had landed at Denver International Airport 24 hours earlier had carried more than passengers. It had delivered a message about what veterans meant to each other and what America owed to those who'd served. The wedding was over, but the larger story was just beginning. 6 months later, Gavin sat in a committee room in the Hart Senate office building, his hands steady on the witness table, as he faced a panel of senators investigating veteran accessibility and civil rights violations. The chamber was packed with media, advocates, and veterans who had traveled from across the country to support testimony that had grown far beyond one man's airport ordeal. Mr. Walton, Senator Patricia Reynolds said, leaning forward with the intensity that had made her a formidable advocate for military families, your experience at Denver International Airport has sparked nationwide policy reviews. Can you tell this committee what changes you've seen in the 6 months since that incident? Gavin adjusted the microphone, his voice carrying the calm authority that had served him in both combat and counseling. Senator, the changes have been remarkable. Over 300 airports have implemented new training protocols for disability accommodation. The TSA has established a veteran liaison program. And perhaps most importantly, we've seen a cultural shift in how society views the ongoing needs of disabled veterans. Behind him in the gallery, he could see familiar faces. Maria Santos, now working as a national trainer for veteran services, had testified earlier about the importance of frontline employee education. Carol Hutchinson, who had transformed Denver International's accessibility programs, sat beside representatives from airports nationwide who had come to learn from their experience. But it was the presence of Sarah's team that meant the most to Gavin. Phoenix Solutions, their newly renamed company, had pivoted from corporate security to veteran advocacy, using their military skills to protect and support former service members navigating civilian challenges. The helicopter incident, Senator Reynolds continued, has been criticized by some as an overreaction. How do you respond to that? Gavin smiled slightly, remembering similar questions from dozens of interviews over the past months. Senator, my former squad leader made a tactical decision based on incomplete information and limited time. In combat, we called that leadership. In civilian life, they called it news. The gentle laughter from the gallery was cut short by Senator James Morrison, no relation to Bulldog, whose skeptical expression suggested he represented the critics. Mr. Walton, while we all respect your service, Don't you think this incident has been blown out of proportion? One bad act at one airport hardly represents systemic failure. The question sparked the kind of controlled anger that Gavin had learned to channel productively. Senator Derek Walsh wasn't an anomaly, he was a symptom. In the 6 months since Denver, my advocacy organization has documented over 400 similar incidents at transportation hubs nationwide. Veterans being treated as threats because of mobility devices, PTSD accommodations being denied, service animals being challenged. He leaned forward, his voice carrying the conviction born of personal experience and professional dedication. The helicopter didn't just rescue me, Senator. It highlighted a problem that had been invisible to most Americans but devastating to veterans trying to rebuild their lives. After the hearing, Gavin found himself on the Capitol steps with Sarah and her team, the autumn sunlight filtering through DC's iconic architecture. The formal testimony was complete, but the real work continued. "How'd it feel, Bulldog?" asked, his trademark intensity now channeled into legislative advocacy. His anger management issues had largely resolved once he'd found purpose in protecting veterans who couldn't protect themselves. Like closing a mission, Gavin replied, "Complete, but part of something larger." Doc approached with her tablet, showing him their latest caseload. Her PTSD counseling practice had expanded nationally, funded by grants triggered by the publicity from the airport incident. "We've got 17 new cases this week, 3 airport accessibility violations, 2 workplace discrimination complaints, and 12 veterans needing navigation support for disability claims." Wrench looked up from his own device, his technical expertise now focused on developing apps and systems to help veterans document and report mistreatment. The veteran reporting platform just hit 50,000 registered users. "We're getting real-time data on problems nationwide." Sarah watched the interactions with the satisfaction of a leader who'd found the mission that defined her team's post-military purpose. Phoenix Solutions just got approved for 3 new federal contracts, all veteran advocacy and support. Turns out there's good money in doing good work. As they walked toward their hotel, Gavin's phone buzzed with a text from Emma. She and Thomas were expecting their first child, a daughter they planned to name Sarah, after the woman who'd taught them that family meant showing up when it mattered most. The photo she'd attached showed the latest viral video making rounds on social media. Derek Walsh being led away in handcuffs after his conviction on federal civil rights charges. The image had been accompanied by thousands of comments from veterans, sharing their own stories of discrimination and support. "Justice served," the text read, "but Dad, the real victory is what you've built from what happened. Love you." That evening, Gavin stood in his hotel room overlooking the Potomac River, talking to Emma on video chat while Sarah's team planned their next day's advocacy meetings. In the adjoining suite, "How does it feel to be a professional troublemaker?" Emma asked, her smile carrying the same warmth that had sustained him through his darkest moments. "Like finding my way home," he replied honestly. The VA counseling helped individual veterans. "This work changes systems." Through the connecting door, he could hear Bulldog arguing passionately about legislative language, Doc reviewing case files with the meticulousness she'd once applied to battlefield medicine, and Wrench explaining technical solutions to problems most people didn't know existed. 6 months ago, he'd been a disabled veteran trying to reach his daughter's wedding, facing humiliation from a petty bureaucrat who saw his sacrifice as inconvenience. Tonight, he was part of a team that had transformed personal trauma into systemic change, turned viral embarrassment into legislative action, and proven that some battles were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible. The helicopter that had landed at Denver International Airport had carried more than passengers. It had delivered a message about dignity, loyalty, and the responsibility of a nation to its veterans. That message was still echoing through congressional halls, airport terminals, and anywhere veterans sought the respect their service had earned. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new veterans needing advocacy, new systems requiring change. But tonight, Gavin Walton looked out over the nation's capital and felt something he hadn't experienced since losing his leg: complete confidence that he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. the mission continued. The brotherhood endured. And somewhere in the distance, thunder still rolled when it was needed most. 1 year after the Denver International Airport incident, the ripple effects continued to spread far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. The Phoenix Solutions headquarters in Colorado Springs had grown from a small office to a 3-story facility, its walls lined with commendations from veteran organizations, congressional resolutions, and photographs documenting the lives they'd helped change. Gavin stood in the main conference room, addressing a group of newly hired advocates, all veterans themselves, each carrying their own stories of struggle and resilience. The morning briefing had become a ritual, a way to center their mission before diving into the day's cases. "Remember," he said, looking at faces that reflected his own journey from injury to purpose, "we're not just processing complaints or filing paperwork. Every case represents a veteran who served this country and deserves better than what they're getting." Maria Santos, now Phoenix Solutions Director of Training, nodded from her position near the whiteboard covered with statistics. The numbers told a story of systematic change. Airport discrimination complaints down 60%. Veteran accessibility training programs implemented in 43 states. And over 12,000 veterans directly assisted through their advocacy network. Today's priority cases, Maria announced, pulling up the first file, include a Marine veteran in Seattle facing housing discrimination, an Army medic in Miami being denied service animal accommodations, and a Navy pilot in Atlanta whose PTSD accommodation request was rejected by her employer. Dr. Patricia "Doc" Williams looked up from her laptop, her expression focused. Her trauma counseling practice had evolved into a nationwide telehealth network, connecting veterans with specialized care regardless of their location. The Seattle case ties into the housing discrimination patterns we've been tracking. Landlords using military medical history as grounds for denial. Legal violation under the Fair Housing Act, Bulldog added, his law degree earned through night school over the past year giving weight to his analysis. His transformation from angry young Marine to passionate legal advocate had surprised no one who understood how combat intensity could be channeled into protective fury. For fellow veterans, Wrench entered the room carrying a tablet displaying real-time data from their veteran reporting app. His technical innovations had created the first comprehensive database of veteran discrimination incidents, providing lawmakers with evidence needed for policy changes. Trending issues this week, he reported, airline accessibility problems, up 15%. Workplace accommodation denials steady at 12 cases daily, and educational institution discrimination showing a concerning spike. Sarah walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee, one of which she handed to Gavin. As CEO of Phoenix Solutions, she'd successfully balanced their advocacy mission with financial sustainability, proving that doing good work could also be good business. Update from Washington, she announced. Senator Reynolds' office confirmed the Veterans Dignity Act passed committee yesterday. Full Senate vote scheduled for next month. The legislation, directly inspired by Gavin's airport ordeal, would establish federal standards for veteran treatment in all transportation hubs, create penalties for discrimination, and fund training programs nationwide. Its passage would represent the most significant veteran civil rights advancement in decades. Gavin's phone buzzed with a text from Emma, now 7 months pregnant and working as a social worker specializing in military families. The photo showed her at a veteran support group, leading a discussion about family resilience. Following in Dad's footsteps, the caption read, just with better footwork. The irony wasn't lost on him. The worst day of his post-military life had become the catalyst for the most meaningful work he'd ever done. The humiliation at Denver's security checkpoint had transformed into a national movement, turning personal trauma into systemic change. "All right, team," Sarah called the meeting to order. "Let's make some veterans' lives better today." As they dispersed to their various missions, legal advocacy, counseling support, policy research, and direct intervention, Gavin remained in the conference room for a moment, looking at the map on the wall dotted with pins representing veterans they'd helped. Each pin told a story of dignity restored, rights protected, and promises kept. The helicopter that had landed at Denver International Airport had been more than a rescue mission. It had been the beginning of something larger. Proof that brotherhood extended beyond battlefields into the ongoing fight for respect and recognition. The thunder they'd brought that day continued to echo across the nation, one veteran at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.